So welcome. My name is Pam Nogales. I am a founding member of Platypus. I was at SAIC at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago at the time. I am currently at the University of Chicago. I teach in the core, in the social sciences core, and I'm a historian of intellectual history, politics of reform, and the crisis of liberalism in the 19th century. It was at the University of Chicago where I first read Capital with Moishe Postone, and it was at SAIC when I first read Adorno, and Chris Catrone was the person that put that in my hands. And I wanted to revisit the founding moment of Platypus. I also wanted to revisit this article, Moishe Postone's article, History and Helplessness. I think that there are some echoes of that founding moment of 2006 and 2007 in the present, and as well as the same kind of pressure that students felt at the time to take a side, that you must take a side, that silence is violence. What side are you on? And we recognize that that this can be an introduction to left politics today, that students on campus are going to be introduced to the left through Israel and Palestine. And so it raises a lot of questions that we've encountered before. Lastly, it was in part provoked, this teach-in, by something that Chris said in the book talk that he gave, Chris Catrone, on his book talk on the millennial left, when he mentioned that there were historical openings in that millennial left moment. I'm a millennial, I'm of that generation. And what were those? What were those possibilities? And yeah, so that's the arc of the teach-in. So the statement of purpose, which I helped to write, we wrote, "The present disorientation of the left means that we can hardly claim to know the tasks and goals of social emancipation better than the utopians of the past did. That is still true. The past month has felt a bit like going back in time for me. This tragedy that is unfolding, the current Israel-Palestine conflict, has brought about some of the worst parts, or rather has brought out some of the worst parts of the social impulses among the so-called left. A profound nihilism has taken the place of political questions. Well, back in 2007, the question we posed to organize the discontent against the Iraq War was, what is imperialism? And as we put in our first panel, why should we be against it? Today, moral indignation has taken the place of a political formulation, and the participants are less able, perhaps less willing, to engage with the history of the left and its defeat. That is, to engage with the history of the left and its defeat as the conditions for the absence of emancipatory political agency today. In other words, does anyone care to ask, why are we left with Hamas and the Israeli state? Are these just representatives of an eternal and ahistorical struggle? Today, this conflict appears to be taking place in a vacuum, in an ahistorical plane, where agency is constituted by oppression, apparently eternal. There are good people, there are bad people. The racism of the European American settlers in Palestine. This is an actual quote from an account called Anti-Capitalism since 1492. So there exists an all-pervasive, eternal, anti-racist struggle in which you must take a side. So that's what the conflict looks like today. Otherwise, you participate in what a placard called at a recent protest, white silence, which equals violence. So this shows desperation, a kind of hopelessness and furthermore, an embrace of violence as redemption, as justice. And this embrace of violence expresses the hopelessness, but it masks this hopelessness, as Postone put it. And this desperation is in the absence of a left political agency. So that's today. That's what the conflict looks like today. And it was slightly different back in 2007, so I thought I would return to this moment to try to work out what it looked like then. I want to emphasize that I'm returning to this moment not out of a kind of nostalgia. There were no good old days, but because maybe the present tasks us to look at our own history, at the memory image of the founding of Platypus, so that we can proceed. So in preparation for the first panel on imperialism, we prepared ourselves with several texts. So we read several texts in preparation to the panel. They included Moishe Postone's History and Helplessness, Mass Mobilization and Contemporary Forms of Anti-Capitalism, that's the full title of the article, and Tariq Ali's Midpoint in the Middle East from 2006, published in the New Left Review. The two, Postone and Ali, stood for remnants of a historical left. They were shards and fragments, and in taking them up, we sought to deepen our understanding of what was happening around us, namely these mass demonstrations against the Iraq War, which were modeled after the popular agitation against the Vietnam War, right? So sort of echoes of history. Platypus was thrown into the history of the New Left by encountering this anti-war movement. And, as a young person in college, these were massive demonstrations. There were millions of people across the world, over 600 cities, millions and millions of people. What did they want? What did these people want? I was not on the left, but as a result of my work in Platypus, I started to ask myself, what was this left? And I became part of the new SDS, the New Students for a Democratic Society at the time. I remember sitting in rooms at different universities and left spaces in Chicago, entering into frustrating conversations about the goals of the anti-war mobilization. We thought, Platypus, members of Platypus that were part of the new SDS, we thought that we could push them not to repeat the same mistakes of the new left unthinkingly. We thought that maybe we could make new mistakes, or we could consider the world anew. At a new SDS meeting at an SAIC in the Michigan building, we argued about what public statement should the new SDS make. The plan on the table: take the Port Huron Statement, written in 1962, rebrand it to the present by making one change: replace Cold War with Iraq War. So we argued against that, and we stopped them from doing that. The sticking point was, of course, as Postone points out, that the absence of a left political force in Iraq raises questions about that replacement. But our intervention felt empty, because what this episode actually revealed was the stillborn character of the millennial left. In front of us, there was a rehearsal of the undigested past. Calls for the revised Huron Statement came alongside chants of Ho 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 Chi Minh. There was no Ho Chi Minh. A bizarre introduction to the left, to say the least. But what was this rehearsal about? The New Left had a grip on the political imagination of our time, and so we had to make sense of it. That's how the present tasked us. We didn't know any better, right? We didn't know what to do. We didn't have the program for a socialist party in our pocket, but what we developed were negative lessons, okay? Calling for UN intervention meant an American presence in Iraq in blue helmets. Troops out now meant a potential massacre, ethnic cleansing, Kurds against Shias, Shias against Sunnis. Calls for the international community to intervene amounted to little more than a moral stance against the brutality of war that handed the reins back to the capitalist butchers. War does conjure up moral indignation. But the question remains, what could the left do? Where was this left, anyway? There were a lot of people in the street, and yet no political agency. In the early years of Platypus, we learned that the Iraqi Communist Party, a fragment of a pre-Ba'athist Iraq, had been ousted from the World Social Forum, which at the time was an international forum for the left. It was ousted because it chose to participate in the provisional government set up by the Americans. So what about this political reality? How did it change? How did it affect what the new SDS want? It didn't. However, outside of the new SDS, things were rather bleak. Verso published Messages to the World, the Statements of Osama bin Laden. Judith Butler claimed that Hamas and Hezbollah were on the progressive left, that somehow the same people that killed socialists, trade union leaders, and women educators were on the side of emancipation. The general sense by the Cliffites, I'll get into it a little bit later about what that is, the general sense by the Cliffites at the time in the United States, who were the Marxist leaders of the anti-war movement, the International Socialist Organization, was that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Anyone that took arms against the United States was somehow on the right side of history. In an interview with Tariq Ali conducted by Platypus in 2007, he cautioned us not to paint all of the resistance to the Americans as religious fanatics, that this was Western propaganda. The Spartacists said, no political support for Saddam Hussein or the Islamic resistance, but military support for the anti-imperialist forces. What did this mean? Were they sending arms to the resistance? We asked, and we were told, that Lenin himself insisted on the distinction between military defense and political support. And they cited a letter on the Kornilov revolt of 1917 in Russia. Apparently, we learned in those conversations, 1917 also haunted the New Left. The Spartacists are a New Left organization. Platypus was born out of frustration that a political impasse was not recognized, that people willfully suspended their disbelief, that in the absence of an emancipatory left, public opposition on the street would amount to little, that the war would come to an end, likely with a negotiation by world powers over how best to manage the tinderbox of Iraq. So we declared, the left is dead. Long live the left, to make room for the future. That in order to create the future left, we had to first recognize the absence of a left. Thinking back, we thought at the time that we had a modest goal. Let's make new mistakes. Let our generation think the world anew again. What could the left become? What do we want from the future? We thought it was modest, but in retrospect, it was a tall order. What can we do? Platypus asks the questions. We wish it were otherwise, by the way. I don't sleep well thinking that I cannot side with the forces of emancipation, that my generation has witnessed nothing but catastrophe. I don't sleep well because that exists, because I don't have to take sides. So this is when we picked up Postone, as well as Ali, to prepare ourselves to ask the questions in our first panel. So what are these fragments and shards? So generationally, Tariq Ali and Postone were part of the New Left. They were on the left in a period of a historical transition from Fordism to post-Fordism to neoliberal global capitalism. Postone describes this transformation as a symptom, an expression of deep historical dynamics and large-scale cultural changes. Capitalist society, according to Postone, is the context to understand social and political phenomena. Politics are functionalized within capitalism. While ideologically disparate, the state-centric management of production relations by both the Keynesian welfare state and the USSR operated within the social historical constraints of capitalism and its form of accumulation. Right, this is Postone speaking. Similarly, the shift to flexible accumulation, the centralization of financial markets, and decentralization of production, the international cultural rebellion of the post-war era, was also bound by the transformation of capital in the post-Fordist period. Capital social relations constrain politics, that is, all sorts of political agency is subject to the constraints of capital. But what does that mean for left politics? Well, it helped to point out, the essay, two different temporalities at work for the left. The first is a historical dynamic of capital and its reconstitution. So we might point to, currently, we're living through the transition from a neoliberal to a post-neoliberal order. Two, second part, the second temporality, is the history of the left itself. That is, the ways in which the left tried to transform society, the trials of previous attempts at emancipation. These attempts also have unintended consequences and can help to advance the reconstitution of capital. The two temporal dimensions overlap. They are not independent from one another. Both the subjective, the left, and the objective, the historical dynamics, these factors are mediated within the context of the present, an arena shaped by the accumulation of history. Could I have some water? Sorry, I'm about to run out, and I've been speaking all day, teaching. Thank you. While Ali and Postone were both of the same generation, both subject to the same historical dynamic, they represent two different historical fragments of the left. So Moishe Postone represents the remnants of the Frankfurt School, the legacy of the Frankfurt School, Lukács, Adorno, Marcuse, and the preoccupation with Marx after Marxism, right? So Postone was asking, how does Marx speak to the present after the degeneration of Marxist politics? That's his concern, or was his concern. Tariq Ali, on the other hand, represents the Cliffite tendency, by which I mean the legacy of the International Socialists. This was a tendency led by Tony Cliff, who, as an aside, is a Palestinian-British Trotskyist born to a Jewish family in Palestine. The International Socialists is an organization which was the forerunner of the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK, founded in 1977, of which Ali was a member. So the Cliffites in America were the International Socialist Organization, which were the leaders of the anti-war movement during the Iraq period. If Postone asks, how do we uphold the insights of Marx after Marxism? Thank you. How can we capture, understand, consider Marx as an imminent critic of capital that is separate from the application of Marx in the present? The Cliffites asked, how should socialists build a practice, a political organization with socialism at its end, after the Soviet Union degenerated into the state management of capital? That is their diagnosis. What that means then is that both Postone and the Cliffites recognized a problem, a historical impasse. Both Postone and the Cliffites were critics of the left. Speaking on his experience as a student to Ben Blumberg and me back in 2007, Postone allied himself with the faction within the Students for a Democratic Society, the revolutionary youth movement, which opposed progressive labor at the time, characterized by Postone, progressive labor is characterized as essentially outside of historical time. In response to this conundrum of facing these organizations which he characterized as outside of historical time, he, along with a friend at the University of Chicago, started a reading group on Hegel and Marx. He said, I'm quoting him now, "We felt that social theory was essential to understanding the historical moment, and that the revolutionary youth movement's emphasis on surface immediacy was disastrous. We read Lukács, who also was an eye-opener, the extent to which he took many of the themes of some conservative critics of capitalism, the critique of bureaucratization, of formalism, of the dominant model of science, and embedded them within Marx's analysis of the commodity form. In a sense, this made those conservative critics look a lot more superficial than they had looked beforehand, and deepened and broadened the notion of a Marxian critique. I found it really to be an impressive tour de force. In the meantime, I was very unhappy with certain directions that the left had taken. So surface immediacy, which is this concern of Postone, and the concrete opposition to capital reappears in the Concerns in the History and Helplessness article, and it's there already for him in his critique of the New Left. On the other hand, the Cliffites, we might gain some insight reading the interview that Ephraim Karlbach, with Ian Birchall back in 2017. Birchall says, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign was basically run by what became the International Marxist Group, which was a fragment of the Fourth International, so the Trotskyists. We set up the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. This was against the British Council for Peace in Vietnam, which was basically run by the Communist Party and the Labour left, and which took a very soft line, which simply called for negotiations. So they were responding to this earlier, the old left. We took a stance that there was a clear line of division, and we were in favor of victory for the National Liberation Front, because this was a struggle for national liberation against imperialism. And that slogan started drawing people. Ian Birchall said that Tony Cliff initially thought that Vietnam was a bit of a distraction. And he changed his mind, however, quite rapidly on that. But it's true that it was our younger comrades, he says, who shifted the International Socialist toward a greater involvement in the Vietnam movement and away from what would have been a very abstract, negative position. So on the one hand, Postone identifies the problem in the New Left as this problem of superficial surface immediacy. And then on the other hand, Ian Birchall recognizes the problem as we can become irrelevant and become a very abstract negative position, principles completely disconnected from reality. So abstract negation, I guess, is Postone then, and then his insistence that Marx is still relevant, whereas the concrete fetishization, I guess, is represented by the Cliffites, who held on to the anti-war movement as a way of making Marxism relevant. So Postone's argument and his main categories in history and helplessness, I've tried to point out a few thus far: this transition, this historical dynamic, and this problem of concrete fetishization. There is also a diagnosis in the article of the state of the Arab and Muslim world, which I think warrants some discussion. He says that there was a steep decline in the Arab world because, for whatever reasons, quote, the authoritarian state structures associated with the Arab nationalism of the post-war Fordist epoch proved incapable of adjusting to these global transformations. These transformations, it could be argued, weakened and undermined Arab nationalism. Such abstract historical processes can appear mysterious on the ground beyond the ability of local actors to influence and can generate feelings of powerlessness. Furthermore, the ideological framework that was already available to make sense of this decline of the Arab world, right, to concretize the problem of freedom and unfreedom, was formulated by thinkers such as the ideologue of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, who rejected capitalist modernity and regarded it as a plot created by Jews, namely Freud, Marx, Durkheim, to undermine healthy societies. Within his anti-Semitic imaginary, Israel was simply the bridgehead for a powerful and pernicious global conspiracy. So this form of misrecognition, Postone argues, is related to this tendency to grasp the abstract, the domination of capital, as concrete, as the Jewish conspiracy, American hegemony, etc. The spread of anti-Semitism, he writes, and relatedly, anti-Semitic forms of Islamism, such as the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and its Palestinian offshoot, Hamas, should be understood as the spread of a fetishized anti-capitalist ideology which claims to make sense of a world perceived as threatening. This ideology may be sparked and exacerbated by Israel and Israeli policies, but its resonance is rooted in the relative decline of the Arab world against the background of the massive structural transformations associated with the transition from Fordism to neoliberal global capitalism. He repeats his critique of the anti-war left during the Iraq War that he had for his colleagues during his own time in the New Left. Recent mass mobilizations, he says, neither expressed nor helped to constitute what arguably was called for in this context, a movement opposed to the American war that at the same time was a movement for fundamental change in Iraq and more generally the Middle East. So he warns his readers through the lessons of the New Left, and especially the turn towards violence in the late 1960s and early 70s. He says that faced with this pervasive socio-political, cultural discontent that would not budge, the bureaucratic stasis of the Fordist world, that people turned to the Cyrillian violence as a moment of this turn to the concrete. That violence was a cleansing act, a redemptive act of regeneration, So this is Cyril. That violence is creative. So he's warning us. Finally, the last category I'd like to introduce is this notion of resistance. So he says, in a quote that we used for the panel, the notion of resistance, however, says little about the nature of that which is being resisted or of the politics of the resistance involved, that is, the character of determinate forms of critique, opposition, rebellion, and revolution. The notion of resistance frequently expresses a deeply dualistic worldview that tends to reify both the systems of domination and the idea of agency. So that's Postone's diagnosis of the Middle East and the responses against capitalism. Tariq Ali, on the other hand, gives a brief history of the left in the Middle East. We interviewed him back in 2007. He starts first with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the transformation of this region into small states under the British and French, which created both a strong nationalist current and the emergence of small communist parties, in part inspired by the late 1905 revolution, The Palestinian question arises within the context of an emerging Nasserite movement in the 1950s, the leader, Nasser, of a secular Arab nationalism. The revolutions in Syria in 56 and Iraq in 58 that followed. At this juncture, says Ali, a vision of the United Arab States with Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad as its capitals seemed possible. However, this vision of a non-radical, that is, a non-Islamist nationalism in the Arab world, which he was embracing as a kind of possibility, was defeated by a series of wars with the final blow in 1967. The rest of this history, from 1980s onward, is a history of US imperialism using religious forces to eradicate socialists and thus creating a void, a turning point of which was the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan in 1989. Ali goes on to point out in the interview with Chris Catron that we need to be careful when talking about the Iraqi resistance. So this is Tariq Ali's warning. We need to be careful talking about the Iraqi resistance because there are secular elements there which the imperialists want to portray as religious zealots, and we should not be duped. For Tariq Ali, Hamas offered an alternative to the Palestinian Authority. He writes, without any of the resources of its rival, it set up clinics, schools, hospitals, vocational training, and welfare programs for the poor. Its leaders and cadres lived frugally within the reach of ordinary people. It is this response to everyday needs that has won Hamas the broad support, not daily recitation of the verses from the Quran. This is Tariq Ali in the New Left Review. And yet, he says, Hamas's programmatic heritage remains mortgaged to the most fatal weaknesses of Palestinian nationalism. The belief that political choices before it are either rejection of the existence of Israel altogether or acceptance of the dismembered remnants of a fifth of the country. So, for him, the question is whether or not Hamas can break with this crippling tradition. In the same breath, interestingly enough, he calls for a single state for Jews and Palestinians alike. Right, so this used to be like the character of the debate, like single state, two-state solution, which, by the way, is absent today. Right? No one's talking in these terms anymore. Finally, he says, it is in the slums that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Sadr brigades have their roots. In contrast with the political leaders that the West relies on, overseas millionaires, crooked bankers, CIA bagmen, and this difference could not be starker. A radical wind is blowing from the alleys and the shacks of the latter-day wretched of the earth, surrounded by the fabulous wealth of petroleum. So for Ali, this history of the left was indispensable, part and parcel in his anti-imperialist position as a Socialist Workers' Party member. I learned about this history of the left, of Arab nationalism, of the small communist parties in Iraq and Iran, specifically via Platypus's engagement with the left. I also learned that there were some glaring omissions to Ali's history of the left, one of which was raised by Richard Rubin, a member of Platypus, in the event that we had in New York with Alan Goodman. Then Richard noted, in 1948, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's dictatorship, supported the creation of Israel. And the socialist camp mentioned above, that is China and the USSR, provided significant, some would argue decisive material aid to Israel. Furthermore, many articles appeared in the communist press at the time, hailing the Israeli struggle as an imperialist one. Arab communist parties, which were small, but which did exist in several countries, particularly Egypt and Iraq, loyally opposed the intervention of the Arab armies and supported the partition. So there was this history there of the communist parties in the region, which we didn't know about. At the time we turned to this history, Ian Morrison, a member of the organization, wrote an article on Baathism, and we read about the Islamic Revolution. We read Fred Halliday, we read Kevin and Janet Afari's Foucault in Iran, Ervand Abrahamian's Between Two Revolutions. Abrahamian, who was interviewed by Spencer Leonard in the Platypus Review, taught us that the rise of radical Islam, which he says is not the same as a form of Arab nationalism, right? So Ali makes this conflation. He says that this radical perspective is just a continuation of a kind of form of nationalism. And Abrahamian says, well, actually, the rise of radical Islam originates in the university students, so he's talking about Iran at the time, that they interpret Islam in a much more quote-unquote socialist way. The main philosopher of this is Ali Shariati, who was very much influenced by Frantz Fanon. What Shariati did was inject into Shiism radical notions of class struggle, equality, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and anti-clericalism. There's a strong anti-clericalism in Shariati. His ideas very much appealed to the graduates, college students, and high school students, and these were the biggest groups of people who organized the demonstrations and were out in the streets in 1977 onwards in Iran. So who is the political leadership of the Islamic Revolution? Here there was a history of the left. Spencer Leonard asked Abrahamian to reflect on the lessons of 1977, 1979. And he wrote that the general expectation of the left was that once the Shah had been forced out and there was an opening, leftist ideologies and movements of the left would come to the fore. Because before the dictatorship of the Shah, before 1953, the organizations had the most mass support in the cities. These were the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, and the National Front. But from 1953 to 1977, these secular organizations were dismantled by the regime, leaving no leftist or internationalist organization intact. While the regime was dismantling leftist organizations and secular organizations, they left undamaged the religious mosques and seminaries, the clerical establishment. So once the regime began to unravel, you had really two opposition groups: the amorphous students, who were chiefly engaged in organizing demonstrations and university protests, on the one hand, and a network of organizations in the mosques and seminaries on the other. The latter, of course, were controlled by the clerics. What I'm trying to draw out here is that this history of the left, which we encountered, was rather complicated. There wasn't like a simple answer. And the more that we educated ourselves, the more that we uncovered about the defeats of the left and their accumulation over the course of the 20th century. Abrahamian represented at the time not the Cliffites and not the Frankfurt School, but a kind of radical liberal perspective, which is also pretty absent today, the rad libs, as we used to call them. And so today the responses are a lot more shrill, right? So there's no Danny Postel, Fred Halliday, Ervin Abrahamian. So Platypus. So the millennial left, Ephraim wrote in his presidential report back in 2021, the millennial left is dead because it refused to recognize that it already was, and so abandoned the chance to be something other than itself. It preferred to believe the old lie that the struggle continues, and so choose what is and what was over what is not, and what could and should have been. 17 years later, after Platypus's founding, was nothing learned. Like, here we are again. Not quite. Our expectations back in the first phase of Platypus were that we could help to make the symptoms on the left sharper, and in that way clear out the obtuse symptoms, like deal with the left. The panels would be a critical tool in this endeavor, and nowhere else could Postone, Abrahamian, Tariq Ali be put into conversation, right? So all of these three, they don't quite make a whole. We knew that without Platypus, such discussions could not take place, and that the absence of the left would not be made palpable. There would be no future left, right? So in our panels, we're not asking you, do you agree with Ali? Do you agree with Postone? Do you agree with Abrahamian? We're not asking that. I think that we've had many unintended effects on the left today, which we clearly did not foresee. A lot has become more obtuse and certainly less historically conscious. The left appears now, more than ever, less capable of reflecting on its own history. But we have to insist. So Platypus has to insist that it does, and we can't recoil from the task. The question of the potential of the millennial left was raised by Chris's presentation, his book talk here at the University of Chicago. And it lingered. I wondered, maybe Platypus was the millennial left's self-overcoming, right? At a different temporal moment. Maybe what was possible then, at that time, was not a socialist party or even the seeds of it, but the beginning of an inquiry, the insistence of a task. So we, as Platypus, made demands perhaps of an unripe reality, that the millennial left recognize itself as something other than what already has been. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think one of the things that we were called were pessimists, and that what we were doing is just pointing out that the left was absent. And Stefan Hein recently sent something to the list where he talks about how perhaps what Platypus is doing is organizing the pessimism, organizing the discontent, and this actually makes us optimists, because we believe that there's a future other than what already exists. That's it. So could we open it up for discussion, conversation? Yeah.
We're reading Postone's essay again. what struck me, I read it when I first came to Platypus, but reading it again recently. But like, he appeals to the new left as like, it was different then. The Viet Cong were a communist party, whereas these guys killed communists in Iraq. But of course, what I immediately thought when I read that line again was that, of course, the Viet Cong did kill communists. They killed Trotskyists. There were even Chinese Trotskyists who fled China out of the revolution, and they were killed by Ho Chi Minh. Well, he was dead at the time, but you get the point. So it seems like the problem is like even further compounded, right? Like even this appeal to like 60s different imagination, like even that is insufficient, right? Like even saying in the 60s, those guys were ostensibly communists, right? But it was Stalinism, it was not great. And of course how Vietnam turned out. Vietnam today is like just a sweatshop, right? One big sweatshop. But yeah, I mean, to focus the question, of course, even in the 60s, even appealing to like the new left as like a higher moment, of course, even that was kind of, yeah, that was already kind of dead. Wasn't that already dead in the beginning? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that one characterization that comes to mind about the new left is the indigestion of the memory of the old left in the new. One way of characterizing this was Stalinophobia and Stalinophilia, right? So either an embrace of a kind of like Maoist turn or a rejection against it and diagnosing of the USSR. The Cliffites have something to do with this as well. I think that one of the problems that we experienced was this compounding of historical defeats that were already present in the new left. And yet, looking back now at this period of working through what the new left was, there seemed to be a profound interest in attempting to make sense of their moment in relationship to 1917, in relationship to like the preceding decades, that there was a sense that there was continuity and discontinuity. And, you know, especially for the Cliffites and for Postone, that they both recognize that they're living in this new moment, that they're living in a new moment and trying to apply like a politics, Marxism, or political theory, like Marx after Marxism, to change circumstances, but that they're not doing that in a vacuum, but they're doing that within like a kind of historical, that they have burdens, they have the burdens of history. Right, so I think that when Postone is comparing the Iraq War to the Vietnam War mobilization, he's not embracing it, right? He says it's not a kind of embrace of the Viet Cong, but the point that he's trying to make is a bit more abstract, that while at the time people opposed the war in Vietnam through a kind of force that was against it, that they could say was on the left, right? You could like critique the left, but you'd say like, okay, it's on the left. That in the Iraq War, this wasn't even considered, that the absence of a left was not considered, and that the principle at work was anti-imperialism. And yet, like, what did this mean, right? Which is why the Spartacists were so confounding for Platypus, because they were like political criticism, but military support. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And then when they came back with Lenin, we were like, oh, okay. So the new left is still hung up on the old left, right? It's like the way in which it makes sense of its positions is in relationship to the old left. But that's educational. That was educational for Platypus. I guess in retrospect now that I think about it, right, it's educational to think about the compounding defeats of the left. It leads us back into this history and trying to think about how we make sense of the present. But one of the problems today, it seems to me, is the absence of any kind of interest in historical consciousness, right? That there's a kind of atemporal response to the Israeli-Palestine question, that it's like bad people or the eternal racist, the eternal racism. It's very much like David, one of our members, was mentioning this, like this kind of nihilism of the BLM moment, where there was a profound, like, the Afro-pessimism moment, right? Like, haven't we always just been, like, racists? But that's not historical, right? That undermines the possibility for politics. Yeah.
Can I expand on
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that did answer, but I don't know, I'm just also learning through this. But at the same time, the situation has changed. Our moment is not in the 60s. Even that moment was degraded. That's what I was trying to raise.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea of like a radical wind that, what's his name, Tariq Ali raised.
Yeah.
Is there something to, I mean, I think in the way Ali approached it, I firmly disagree, like Hamas is a radical wind, but from his cliff-like perspective, I assume he was seeing, oh, like the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of these Stalinist parties, the fall of Arab nationalism could have opened, like the fact that these movements died, these 60s movements died, it could have led to an opening, right? Do you think that's at the same time, that moment is gone, right? Like, there's no, we can only talk about it in hindsight. But like the way we talk, like we regress from like the 60s, there's regression. Of course, at the same time, we don't have this obstacle of the communist parties anymore. We don't have this obstacle, which were huge obstacles, which were never overcome by Trotskyism. So yeah, I don't know if your comment is, could we flip this around, turn it into a story of progress instead of just, I don't know, like, is Hamas a bigger obstacle than the Arab national? Maybe I'll rephrase. Is Hamas today a bigger obstacle to the left than Nasser? I don't know.
I thought your question was going somewhere a little bit different,
Sure.
so maybe I'll answer where I thought that you were going, which is like, you know, turning a liability into like an opportunity. And maybe I didn't expand enough, but you know, the platypus could be the self-overcoming of the millennial left. The death of the left presents an opportunity. The death of the millennial left specifically presents an opportunity for us, right? And it's not just about compounded defeat, but rather, could we recognize the world anew? Like, could we think about what the left could become without the unconscious rehearsal of accumulated defeats? Are we going to get stuck in small rooms again, trying to rewrite the Port Huron Statement? Because that's how this whole millennial left thing started. And I hope not. You know, the mass demonstrations across the world right now, again though, like raise the specter of the new left, don't they? Except now that the placards are like, white silence equals violence. Whereas back in the day, it was like the RCP, the world's on fire, like what shall we do? So I felt that that's what you meant in terms of possibilities. I would rather think about it this way rather than trying to calculate whether or not Hamas versus Arab nationalism, because that's what Tariq Ali is doing. Tariq Ali is saying that, okay, there was this Arab secular nationalism. And in contrast to that, right, so Hamas is not that, but it's informed by that, but it needs to break from something. And he's trying to make this assessment of forces, this as like, well, which one is better? Which one is better? Where can we go? Whereas at the same time, in the same breath, he's calling for a one-state solution. So it has this kind of disconnect from reality at the same time while he's saying this. And I don't think we should start with that question, I guess, is what I'm arguing. I don't think we should start with the question, like, which is better, right? But what do we want? How do we transform the historical dynamism that, Postone is talking about? How do we deal with that constraint on political activity?
I guess a lot of when you talked about the language of the 1970s, like the 70s left, and the sort of like radical chic-ness of it. And one thing that comes to mind is decolonization and like the movement, decolonization in the 70s as a political project, and how that the idea of decolonization as a project gets still presented today as a possibility on the left, but it seems to me to be unclear what that would even look like. Because in the 70s it seemed like that was like it was tried, right? And it failed, seemingly. But yet this language still kind of looms over us today in a much less clear sense. And so I guess I'm thinking about how one could think about the way that the 70s also seems to be coming back, like this sort of radical chicness, but in a more regressed form, right? Because the idea of the radicals of the 70s, late 60s and the 70s, was this idea of bringing terrorism home, right? Like they were committing terrorist acts here. I'm not advocating for that to happen here, but even that seems to be, gone also. So I'm just, I guess, asking how do you see that legacy today? In lieu of, there was an actual movement of the students in the 70s and the 60s.
The decolonization, there is decolonization as led by secular forces of Arab nationalism. There's decolonization within the context of the Second International and the question of the empire. There's decolonization led by whom and for what, I guess is the question. When it becomes fetishized as a form of politics of resistance, then there's no political judgment being made on what the content is. I was also just reminded that there was a sense of this violence as retribution, even in the Iraq War. They're latent when people would say things like, 9/11 was like the chickens coming home to roost and these kinds of things, right? Like retribution, it was just, it was retribution. And so this language maybe is just available there, and for Postone it expresses a kind of helplessness, expresses a helplessness that masks its helplessness, right? Because it feels like you're doing something. It's been pretty grotesque. I don't know how much you all have been exposed to the way in which the left has been dealing with this, or just popular accounts online, or the way that students have been talking about it. I saw this one graph of, it was a picture of close up on a part of Israel, and then it had these percentages, and it said what percentage of the population agrees with the state actions in Gaza, and some number, 73% or some number, and and I was like, oh God, what this little graph was doing, right, is saying everyone is complicit, civilians are complicit, everyone is complicit for action. Thus, when there's retribution against civilians, it's just because look. So I think that's around. I think that's there. Violence is a form of just retribution. But I guess maybe one thing to point out, right, which is what you raised, was that decolonization is not some kind of ahistorical principle, that it was about considering the forces on the ground and thinking about the kind of political leadership that would be available. When it becomes a kind of principle in the abstract, then I guess any form of resistance by colonized peoples or somehow emancipatory. Although I think what drops out is the question of emancipation, right? So like one of the things that Postone is getting at in his article is that when the issue is like who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, then the question of freedom drops out. And he says, and who picks it up? The right. That the right was the only one talking about like this question of liberty and freedom. And the left stopped talking about that and started talking about, are you against the Americans? Are you against the provisional government in Iraq? And if you're not, they told the Iraqi Communist Party, and if you're not, then you're not on the left. And so like what drops out when we think in terms of like violent retribution against the oppressor? Like, are we talking about the left? We did some interviews recently in some of the protests for the podcast. I run the podcast for Platypus. And some of the people recognize this, they recognize, like, we asked them, is this a protest on the left? We asked them, like, how do you consider this? And some of them said, it doesn't really seem to be about the left. It doesn't seem to be about that. It seems to be a kind of like moral judgment, right? It's like a moral judgment. Like, you should be disgusted. You should be upset. And so there is a kind of sense of recognition that like there's no politics here, right? And so there's a vacuum that perhaps like some feel and others mask by appealing to violence, right? So some feel the absence and sort of mourn the fact that there is no place for their moral stance to be actualized in the world, and others like fill that vacuum by saying that justice is being done when violence is committed against the oppressors. Yeah.
I could ask that again. Well, I'll just say first, like on how this movement, you gave your reflection how this movement might be similar or might be different in 2007. I guess one thing I'm not sure you mentioned was like the lack of like a gadfly figure like Christopher Hitchens, right, who famously and infamously supported the Iraq War. Although we do have that with anti-Deutsch, but like Hitchens was much more of a gadfly, right? The anti-Deutsch is like full on the activism. Also, there's like free speech stuff in Germany. I mean, we'll go into it. I mean, also reading like the Postone essay, when he talks about camps, it made me think about what he doesn't bring up, which is like the old Shachtman third camp idea, right? I don't know if there's like, which seems very, very much removed from our movement, right? Like the idea of a third camp. Of course, that was like a stillborn idea. The Shachtmanites try to find a third camp everywhere in the world, and they never ended up finding one. Whereas this third camp, but there was like an instinct to find a third camp, or something of that nature. I think in 2007. Today, maybe it's much more Israel versus Palestine, side of Israel. Like even Hitchens sided with the Kurds, right? Like the socialist Kurds from below, right? Well, he's not supporting a state body; he's supporting these other socialist oppressed minorities. He knows this whole thing. Okay. Okay, I could say something more, but I don't know. Those
Well,
were
what's,
just thoughts.
sorry, I'm not sure what,
My
okay.
question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what you make of that there isn't like this right-wing, so-called right-wing like response, this ultra-right response, a la Christopher Hitchens. Oh, but one thing I do want to say is Ukraine kind of does make it seem different because like the people you're hearing this kind of Hamas or soft on Hamas, pro-Hamas, soft on Hamas, not critical of Hamas is usually from the DSA. It's from the same people who are relatively in support of Ukraine for like liberal reasons. They will give liberal justifications for like Ukrainian democracy, Ukrainian like Ukraine is a liberal democracy, whereas Russia is an autocracy. But I don't know if this goes too far away from your original presentation, but there just seems to be disconnect. There's like this position on Ukraine, but then when we come to Israel-Palestine, we seem to have a totally different view of things. Okay, but I don't know, I'm just rambling. I'm just saying my thoughts in response to your presentation.
Okay, maybe we could take some others. I'm curious, like how others have received the presentation. Yeah.
So one of the themes that keeps coming up here is kind of this need to think critically and think historically. And I'm wondering, what is your take on how do we do that in an age, in a media environment that's so hyper-saturated with the demand for action? There's like a Dornian like cardboard joke in here somewhere, that seems to be like increasingly difficult to do. Probably much more now so than even in 2006 or 2007. How do we, is there a way out of this predicament, or are we just damned to the fascism of Instagram story posting forever?
How do we develop a critical historical perspective in the present where there's a pressure to act?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, our gamble in Platypus is that you can have the space and time for critical historical conversations, that it's possible and that they are necessary, and that sometimes we have to grab the left kicking and screaming and bring them to campus in order to ask them questions about what they're doing. And there is this pressure, I think, on students today, like there was then, to act. And yes, the Adorno would be pseudo-activity, right? The pseudo-activity of the present. The feeling that you're doing something, whereas you're doing nothing. Certainly students think that they are doing something by joining protests, and they are exposed to the education on the left. That's what's happening. That's what's happening in the protests. They go, they pick up pamphlets, they talk to people. Although now I don't know if there are pamphlets. Like, what are the pamphlets that are being distributed? Are there pamphlets?
RCP.
The RCP, okay. The Revolutionary Communist Party are handing out pamphlets. But they're looking at the placards, right? And that's how they're being introduced to the left. So that's the activity. We just want to make that more conscious, right? So if the students are being educated by the remnants of the left in a placard, in an RCP pamphlet, we want to make it self-conscious. Come to campus, have the conversation. What is the left? What should it do? Why? I hope it's possible. I think it's possible. I think that there are people in this room now, and so I think it's possible. I also think that it's much harder, and some of the problems that our new members in Platypus experience is that they go to the reading group, they go to the Platypus reading group, and they get a really sophisticated introduction to the history of the left. Right? They read Lenin, they read Kautsky, they read Luxemburg, they read Adorno, they Kolakowski, etc. And then they go into the world, and then somehow it doesn't matter. And it feels like there's a disconnect between the lessons of the history of the left and raising these questions, and then the way in which people are presenting their opposition. And the two just aren't meeting. You know, so every once in a while, this is why it was like, the RCP. The RCP was there, right? So there was something. There was a Revolutionary Communist Party there. But mostly it's not, right? Mostly it's not. The ISO was folded into the DSA, the International Socialist Organization. The Cliffites was folded into the Democratic Socialists of America. So that collapsed. The Spartacists, I mean, we know, like, we're going to make them speak at our Israeli-Palestine events. So they're going to be there. But they were absent for a long time. The sectarian left collapsed. Moishe is dead. And so it's difficult. Like, how do you curate the conversation? If we in Platypus want to curate this, we have to host a conversation on the left. Like, we insist on the questions, right? Like, who do we ask the questions to? And more, I think the difficulty is that we seem to carry, like I've tried in the presentation, we seem to carry like the historical memory of a left that would have spoken at our panels, right? So Tariq Ali would have spoken at the panels. He would have said this as a representative of the Cliffites. Ervin Abrahamian, we've had on panels on the Iranian Revolution. He'd spoken, the Rad Lib. And, you know, there's an absence of that. But I don't know. We'll see, because I think that what's happening right now is this repoliticization, and we just need to know what, like, we need to figure out what it's going to look like. And I think that people on campuses, students on campuses are being told, you should be part of the left. Maybe what it sounds like, though, is you should be against the racists. So we're there to intervene on that miseducation. We're there to intervene to say that's not what the left is. That's not what you should consider.
I wanted to ask if you could clarify what you think the importance of studying like the old left is. I know that, you know, Platypus emphasizes like revolutionary Marxism. That reading group's about to begin. You know, Katroman talks a lot about Lenin and his, you know, significance, but at the same time, you know, as you discussed earlier, like there are these kind of gross misuses of these figures, like the Sparks appealing to Lenin for, you know, to justify military support for anti-imperialism. Figures like, you know, the Cliffites and Tariq, who seem to kind of, and, you know, at the same time, maybe RCM a little bit. You know, we're kind of surrounded by figures who, when the old left is invoked, it seems to be wrongfully, but, you know, Platypus still finds these figures really important. So could you talk about what precisely it is that we ought to be, or that we can learn from them, and how we can avoid making these mistakes that other groups make and appealing to those figures in that history?
Oh man, that's a tall order. So one thing I would just say is that, like, Platypus is part of the dead left, right? So we're not like drafting the socialist program and leading the revolution. We're an educational project that we think that there's certain historical questions which haunt the present, which would need to be taken up in a future left. That there are certain questions that need to be asked. That when the Spartacists make their members read what is to be done, right? That we should ask, why does Lenin haunt the present? Why does 1917 haunt the present? And that's why we return to these questions. So what we're not doing in the reading group is trying to find like a solution or an answer to the present impasse, but rather to consider what the history of the left is, because we think that the left is a historical project for human emancipation that's not reducible to the way in which it appears throughout history, right? So it's a principle that's not reducible to its actors in the world, and that's what we're trying to learn in the reading group. We're trying to learn what it means, what it meant to be on the left. You know, so we take up the French Revolution, we take up Adam Smith. How did the question and problem of emancipation transform throughout human history? And we go to the reading group. We ask ourselves those questions in the reading group. I think that the application through a kind of pastiche of certain positions that different people on the left throughout time have taken, and the application of it to the present is vulgar, and in fact doesn't consider that these were, I mean, certainly Lenin, political calculations made in regards not only to the forces on the ground, right, which is sort of an obvious statement, but also the state of the left, right? So, and that means that when you quote Lenin and you say, this is what we should do because Lenin said, you're doing violence to that history, that you're actually creating an atemporal plane where you're just sticking those different positions into. So we have negative lessons to learn, We have negative lessons to learn. And then we have this question of what is the left, which continues to plague us. I didn't mean to dodge your comments. I think that one thing that you brought up was Christopher Hitchens. And of course, he was not in my presentation, but he was looming quite large for us as well. And, you know, Hitchens had this line, "I didn't leave the left, it left me." And as a way of, you know, he's like, I'm not a neocon, but like, obviously he's like aligned, like people would align him with the neocons. And like, what does that mean? That he used to be a Trotskyist. Like, what does that mean? And I think that it raised for us at the time this shift of, can the left become the new right? And we're not talking about Hitchens. We're talking about like the support of like forces like Hamas. Can the left become a new right and thus generate conservative responses to the left? And Hitchens was a lesson in that. Like, what does it mean that in the left becoming a new right, in defending the, you know, killers of trade union leaders, women educators, socialists, that it aligns itself with the right, and then those on the left feel homeless, adrift, and that those on the left that want to be politically relevant then find new projects that are concessions. Because he did say, I don't believe the revolution is possible anymore, right? Hitchens made a judgment. It's like, it's not possible. Socialism is not possible. That's what he said. And so within that context, right, like he chose the political forces that aligned with his principles. So we think the revolution is possible and that it's an open-ended, it's a task. And so we're not Hitchens, but Hitchens has a point.
I think to be fair, Hitchens still in his lost writings, he said, and this is in Spencer's review, in the Platypus review, Spencer Leonard, one of the members wrote a review. He said nonetheless, the contradictions of capitalism persist. It's just that the revolution is impossible.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is part of Postone's argument as well, that the left can become a new right? Like that's, you know, and that it does so in part by not addressing the problem of freedom. That if it's no longer tasked with the problem of freedom, it can just defend all sorts of reactionary forces. Yeah.
So, and Pamela was saying the left is dead, along with the left. So, but there are leftists that we take on our panels, and in that case, if the left is dead, this is in some sense they are the right, are they not? Or I guess what I'm trying to clarify is like, what is it that we're searching for in approaching these leftists and putting them on panels and interviewing them? Is it that they're even in their deadness, there's something there? And so like, what is the role of Platypus as an organization in trying to bring out this history and this seemingly dead left?
Yeah, I mean, this is, the formulation used to be the fragments and shards of the history of the left, the detritus of the accumulation of defeat that we run into, you know, the left, the dead left, trying to explain to itself what it does by connecting its position and its actions to a history. And that we want to ask questions about that. And that they are an entryway, a way in which we can crack something open that we should say does not have to be remembered. I mean, like the memory of Marxism could just become irrelevant and be forgotten. And so they are entryways into a kind of historical consciousness. We host the conversation on the left, again, not because we want you to choose which fragment is right, but in a sense to point out an absence of being able to make that choice. That there's something about putting the constellation of perspectives together, of Ali, of Postone, of Abrahamian, that seems to illuminate something beyond what they're saying, right? That taken as a whole, they seem to illuminate a problem, an absence. And so the way that we think about curating panels is this idea of triangulation, of like what's going to be pushed out as a result of putting people into conversation that would otherwise not speak to one another. And how could we then use that as an opportunity to educate ourselves about what the left was, what it can be, and what the current obstacles to its transformation are. So it's a mediated task. We're educating people. The way that we used to put it was that perhaps in the audience, right? Perhaps in the audience there was someone that wanted to lead a different project on the left, and they would be welcome, right? So you wouldn't be doing that in Platypus, but Platypus would be a place where you could think about it, and you could reflect, and you could go back and think about what your tasks are, and that in the division of labor that we imagined coming about as a result of Platypus, that there would be those trying to build political projects, and that we would insist that alongside that, a critical conversation on the history of the left would need to happen. And that perhaps, there would be no need for Platypus, because the left itself would transform in such a way, the creation of a new left would include that critical historical conversation, and that, right, that we would overcome the necessity for Platypus. But yes. Yeah.
So, right, the death of the left being our current predicament, our pre-political moment, right? Because what is called the left today, what Platypus would critique as being not a left, being dead. So I think we would also say, like, you can't transform a dead left into a living left. And so, like, why the left? Like, and Platypus says the left is a tool that we are using, theoretically, to negate what, like, our present conditions, right? So, like, what exists currently, since the left is dead, is a politics of the right, purely a politics of capitalism, right? We have various groups proposing different ways to manage the crisis of capital. And it's all within a capitalist politics, right? And it's all within a modern bourgeois understanding of what we're trying to we're still trying to achieve the bourgeois revolution, because we have not yet achieved a perfect democracy. We have not yet achieved equality, like, we have these fundamental beliefs that people are equal, right? And that we have equal rights. And yet we have this immortal capital that has kind of like universalized a global society. You know, we all understand it, no matter what state we're from. We do understand capital now. So that is the most revolutionary thing that we have achieved. So what it would mean to be more revolutionary than capital itself would mean that you have to have a politics born, because it's not happening now, a politics born that aspires to something beyond capital politics, right? And you mentioned the crisis of Fordist politics and the Keynesian welfare economics in the 70s. So you mentioned the crisis of that, right? And then kind of this like return to an attempt at like a liberal, right? In the neo-liberal politics now. So it's not that we've gone beyond the Fordist politics, right? Of like the state will administer, you know, various measures to attempt to mediate the crisis of capital, right? And then the more like hands-off liberal kind of politics. And then I think what you were mentioning was like Postone is noting a crisis of neo-liberalism then. And this is where I'm wanting a little bit of clarification, but I guess maybe to respond to your question, why do we read about the historical left? And it's because we have these ideas, and they of like what we think things should be, and where did we get those ideas, right? So it's like but you know they're not natural, right? They're not. It's modern. It's a modern concept we have, but that our politics is insufficient, is inadequate, right, to the task of achieving our modern sense of right, you know, human right. And capital keeps bumping, you know, coming into contradiction with what we believe is human right, you know. And we don't have a politics that's adequate to grasp that. And so this is why we really do need to read about past attempts of trying to grasp that. And the height of trying to grasp that politics, Platypus says, was during the international socialist revolutionary movement, which, you know, failed and was decimated. But, you know, we in the left today will still use the words and the slogans without actually having any kind of international, you know, any kind of politics that is really aspiring to get beyond the crisis of capital. This is just what I've been thinking as a response to what you said. But if Pam, I don't know if you could mention a little bit more about what Postone was talking, like what Postone was noting as a crisis or a turn in conditions.
Yeah, I had a few responses. So what Erica is referring to is this, like, complete the bourgeois revolution sentiment. And primarily, though, I would say not through like the completion of right, but rather like the transformation of the problem of freedom, which is why we read Adam Smith and Marx. And I think, if I understood correctly, you were talking about this as we need to know what it looked like. Like, we need to know what those attempts were like, and that there's this philosophy of history at work in the syllabus, which is that there's a high watermark in attempting to work through that problem of freedom, and that is tied to the history of the socialists, right? So that's like the syllabus, the Platypus syllabus, like what it's guided by. The dead left, the zombies speak. We need them to speak in order to try to grasp that history, but also in order to understand what the left can become. Postone was talking about the transition, the transformation from a Fordist to a post-Fordist and the emergence of a neoliberal order. What's interesting is that he characterizes the left as somehow unable to grasp an opportunity in the neoliberal moment, because he says that in fact it was wedded to this national and this like the camps, that it was wedded, there was a lag, right? There was of an opportunity, the missed opportunity of what the new historical moment, the new historical conditions presented. And rather than grasp that potential for internationalism and a cosmopolitan left, it retreated back into like nationalist and concretistic, fetishized forms of anti-capitalism. And so he's trying to recognize a historical opportunity present as a result of the transformations in capital that the left did not grasp. And that way, it lagged behind the revolutionary character of capital. Our moment, I guess, we're moving into, I don't know, like trade blocks, a multipolar world, right? Like we have a question now, like what's post-neoliberalism? It's not an abolition or eradication or, there's not deletion of neoliberalism, but rather it's transformation. And so the left, we need to ask, what are the current historical possibilities? What is the opportunity of the conditions of the present, rather than thinking of the past in a kind of pastiche that can be applied, right? Like dredging up the old slogans in order to make sense of the present.
I did want to tackle something that you reiterated, which was nihilism, the nihilism of the contemporary left. I'm just curious, do you think the contemporary left is more nihilistic than in the millennial movement, in your experience in the millennial left? Also, what does that mean for the death of the left? If the left is more nihilistic today than it was, or the coming generation of leftists are more nihilistic today than they were in the millennial left, do you think that has any implications for Platypus or our approach to the left, or anything else?
I mean, recently in our communication, David Faye's raised this as, the nihilism of BLM is back. Like, people are just so profoundly hopeless. And it, I think that is like a development that's quite stark as of the last 5-6 years. But I think that's just the miseducation by the millennials. I think that's just that playing out, and that it need not be that. I don't think it's the left so much as the general like cultural opposition, that there's this kind of hopelessness. It's not usually articulated in a politics. This is why, shout out to like the segment on the Afro-pessimism, but we went into this when we talked about Afro-pessimism, that it naturalizes, it reifies a kind of hopelessness, the absence of political agency. Instead of questioning, pointing to it and pointing out an absence, it just says, well, it must be. This is the way things must be, right? Like all of history adds up to one long fight of the anti-oppressors and the racists. And that's what it must be. And Postone is like raising the question, well, must it be? What's absent? What is not there? And so I think it's bad. I don't think that it's a good symptom. And I think that, you need hope. You need the hope that the world could be otherwise. And I think that hope is now being directed towards a kind of like moral outcry, and it doesn't have a place to go. And the more nihilistic tendencies are actually this like embrace of that, as Susan Sontag put it, the white race is the cancer of society, right? So that's the nihilism. That's what it looks like now. And it's a kind of undoing of modernity, right? Freedom is a lie set up by white people to dupe the oppressed people. It's not, it was never real. Watch out, don't be duped. And Platypus and the syllabus would say, well, that has nothing to do with the left. Like the syllabus has taught us that sentiment has nothing to do with the left. And that what we need to ask ourselves is the question again and again, like, how does the problem of freedom appear to us in the present? How has it appeared in history? How has it transformed? How does the demand, for example, for democracy transform in the middle of the 19th century, in 1848, to the Bonapartist management of discontents, right? So Marx's moment, like 1848, Marx's moment, is about working through the crisis of democracy, the crisis of the bourgeois revolution, the impossibility for the bourgeois revolution to be completed under new social historical conditions, of which the left is a fermenting factor. And society appears to be divided against itself for Marx. And that problem, that contradiction, that self-undermining dynamic of capitalist society will need to be grasped through forms of misrecognition, right? I mean, this is the bit about Postone that's a little tricky. You can't like grasp capital. You're not gonna like, but that you would need to work through forms of misrecognition on the left in order to try to, as you put it, wield its revolutionary potential for something other than the repetition of the unfreedom of capitalist society. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a ramble, but yeah.
Well, this versus anyone else. Okay, so on that note, I think the way you characterize like Hamas's anti-capitalism as like nihilistic, so that implies that we can't go through something like the anti-capitalism of Hamas. Is that the implication, or the left? I don't know. But I feel like
Hamas is not anti-capitalist, meaning like what's happening. The reason why like Shariati got brought up, right? It's a right. Okay, so the profound nihilism of Hamas. Okay. Like what is it? What is it that is the unfreedom of society? What is the unfreedom about? The conspiracy, the Jewish conspiracy? Postone is like, no, that's right. So he would characterize that as like fetishized forms of anti-capitalism, right? To make a point that unfreedom is being misrecognized, that the problem of unfreedom is being misrecognized. But that raises this other problem, which is, okay, what would it mean to adequately recognize the problem of unfreedom and develop a politics adequate to that recognition? which is why you have to look at the history of the left, right? And like raise that question of like working through forms of misrecognition, right? So Postone used to say, the Second International, Lenin, Luxembourg, they just thought that like the form of unfreedom is like going to be resolved through the embrace of a kind of proletariat politics, right? They were affirmative about the proletariat, like he would say this. They were affirmative about the proletariat, they fetishized labor, right? And in that way, they also committed a problem. They committed the same mistakes, the fetishized forms. Of course, right, like reading these texts that we do in the reading group raises for us, I think, the question of whether or not, like Lenin, Luxembourg, Trotsky, believed that there was nothing inherently emancipatory within the worker himself, but that rather, that if you want to tackle the problem of capital's unfreedom, that it would have to be in and through, like fighting, right, fighting to transform social relations, and that the working class could be, need not be, but could be a force in that transformation. So could Hamas? No, because it's not interested in transforming social relations to overcome the problem of capitalism. And it's much closer to, I raised like Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood as somehow being not the same as Arab nationalism, right? It's much closer to that perspective. And it's a profound disenchantment with the entire project of the bourgeois revolution. That's what that's about, right? Like, so Khomeini and all of this, like what we learned when we studied the Islamic Revolution is that there was this other response that you could have to the unfreedom of capitalism. You could say, who's at fault? The entire history of modernity, like the whole project of enlightenment. Like, it's just all wrong. So is that the grounds for a socialist politics? No, because socialism needs bourgeois right. We need, right? Like, we need freedoms in order to organize. And also we are tasked by the bourgeois revolutions to complete it, not undo it, right? That's what Erica was trying to put together. Like, it's a completion of the bourgeois revolutions, not a revolt against it. Not a revolt against it. And I think, to be fair, like the Shariati moment is interesting because I think that there's a kind of expression of attempting to do so. Like can we use like the forces of the colonized in order to fight against capitalism? And, so can you? As it turns out, the decades after, in retrospect now we can say, well, what did it amount to? And maybe the old Cliffites, the people that were like, this is a distraction, maybe they had a point. Maybe they had a point to say, well, it's not going to happen in Vietnam, guys. Like, the Vietnamese people are not going to lead the revolution against capitalism. That it would have to happen here, that it would have to happen in the UK, in France, in Germany, that it would need to happen in the centers of capitalist politics. That was not, to be clear, that was not to say those people shouldn't struggle for their freedom, but that rather that you're undermining the fight for their emancipation if you focus solely on this conflict without considering the constraints of capitalist politics, which are directed, right? The rackets are here. Like the main, the powerful rackets, they're here, so like what of that? What of that? I mean, Israel-Palestine, like that's the tragedy. It's like, it's very tragic what's happening, right? Like it's awful. And I don't know, like why aren't we asking like what needs to happen here? What needs to happen here so that the monstrosities don't continue? And instead it's like, no, the political agency of the dispossessed. I'm from Peru, I'm an immigrant. And it's just like, it's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen in Peru, right? And the attempts to do so, again, People fight for their freedom. Yeah. What are the political constraints under which those fights take place? How can people fight for emancipation? And how could we, in the United States and in other places of the centers of capital, how could we create a different condition so that those struggles for emancipation outside of the United States, outside of the capitalist centers of power, could be more meaningful towards human emancipation, rather than fighting over scraps, right? Like, anyway.
We could pressure Joe Biden to have a ceasefire, to put pressure on pressure Biden, pressure Netanyahu, pressure the army to not go into Gaza.
I think this is why people are reaching into Lenin and the Maoists, because they're like, oh, the DSA strategy, that, right? DSA strategy is that, like the Democrats, pressure the Democrats, right? And people are like, oh, snap, like that is not working, right? It didn't work. It didn't work. And so now they're like, well, where can we stand on? Like, we should probably think about like Lenin or something, right? And there is a kind of a vulgar, like, reaching into history, which we also want to mediate. Like, when people reach into history in order to critique the DSA, well, they're like, oh, we're gonna, read about Ho Chi Minh. We want to be like, why are you reading about Ho Chi Minh? What do you want? Like, what are you trying to reach for? What is it that you're trying to educate yourself about in order to critique the DSA or to move on from it? I think that the European Conference is doing a panel on Lenin, kind of precisely on this question, right? Like, why are people returning to Lenin now? Like, what does it mean to read Lenin in the crack up of the DSA? Like, people seem to want something from this history. And so, we're there to ask, like, yeah, what do we want? What do we want history to speak to us for? Yeah.
There seems to be like a sort of constructive vision, I guess, the way that the left kind of, Postone gets at this in his article, where it's like, if you look deep enough in any sort of conflict in any part of the world, you'll find the US or you'll find a Jew. And like taking on the view that the US is just this massive imperialist, destructive, white supremacist country, it recognizes the sort of potential there in the US, but somehow it can only be destructive, and that there can only be like support for like some third worldist cause that can is like the victim of the US. So in some sense, it's recognizing a sort of potential in the US, right? In recognizing that it has this destructive imperialist force, whatever that means. But it kind of gives that up in favor of defending like the underdogs, right? That they, in some sense, don't have any real potential in defeating the imperialist powers, right? Like it's almost like advocating for like just bloodshed, and it is advocating a sort of responsibility of like, what can we as leftists in the US do? And I guess posing the question is like, what would, I guess, a sort of intervention in that sort of outlook look like? Would it be like looking for, because I guess what seems to be missing here is the Israeli working class. That seems to just be out of the question when we're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's like, what about the people of Israel who are workers, who have who would have some stake in an international politics that's geared towards emancipation, right? But somehow that kind of just like goes out the window. Like that's like the very big glaring abyss that kind of haunts this whole conversation. Because somehow they're also part of this like white supremacist agenda towards eradicating Palestinians and just being settler colonialists, right?
Also, the other Palestinians, right, that Hamas
Right.
killed, which, it's like often left out of the equation, the people that are protesting
Well,
Hamas.
yeah.
Could I just respond to your original question, though, about the abdication of responsibility? The abdication of responsibility. So one of the things that was confounding in the position that the Spartacists took at the time of, right, like political criticism, no support for the politics of the resistance of Hussein, but like military support, because why? Because the anti-imperialism principle on the left. And I remember, I don't know if it was Nick Kreitman, somebody was like, so how are you going to sell that to the American workers? How are you going to organize the American working class by telling them that they should be in military support with the anti-imperialist forces in Iraq? Because you would need to organize the American working class, right? You would need to organize the American working class, I mean, if there's a lesson to be drawn, right? Like you turn the forces of the empire against itself, right? So the American working class would need to be organized. The army would need to be split, right? Like all of these, like maybe it doesn't apply, but I think it does, right? You need to start here. And it was an abdication of responsibility, in a sense that naturalized the impossibility of doing that, right? That it reified, it said, well, that's not possible. And there are different ways in which the left said this, right? Oh, the workers have been, betrayed by the trade union leaders, right? So that was one way. And thus, we need to intervene in the trade unions and, who knows, but also holding this position about the anti-imperialist forces. Yes. I think that now, though, thinking about how this applies to today, I was just reading that the Belgium workers, some part of the Belgian workers have stopped production of certain weapons. This was plastered across the different readings that I was doing, and I was like, oh, okay. So there is a sense that an international working class response, right, would be necessary in order to really stop the conflict. You would have to have an international response, not the international community, right? Not the capitalist butchers, but somehow. And so if that's the case, if there's recognition that there needs to be an organized working class movement, they could really disrupt, they could really raise the question, raise the problem of the absence of socialist leadership, or why do we have to be flooded by this tragedy constantly? What does it mean? that would be stepping up. That would be raising the problem of leadership, I guess, to the old Trotsky's line, right? The absence of leadership. And that when the Spartacists said that, political critique, military support, that they were misleading the people. And that's what they were doing. But there's such a small group that I think ultimately what they were trying to do is hold on to the legacy of a different moment. And what they really were doing is trying to hold on to a relic, trying to say, we think that, the Fourth International, still, you should look at this history. And so we treated them in good faith in that way. Yeah. It is 8:09, and I wonder if we could wrap up. I certainly have taught all day, so I'm quite spent. Yes.
Okay, this will be our last question. It's a bit of a compound that just occurred to me. When you read the Tariq Amin comments on why he was excited by Hamas, he mentioned they're social services or something. It's not because of the Quran, it's because of they do all this stuff. They give food to people, and they I can't remember. They educate the kids, right? Which Postone also brings up in his essay. I don't know if you have a comment on that. Why the left is enraptured by that, there's basic services that these kind of movements provide. Yeah.
Okay, I should say that Ali's not excited by Hamas, right? He's trying to understand what it is, and the formulation that he has is that Hamas offered an alternative to the Palestinian Authority. By simple example, he says, without the resources of its rival, it set up clinics, schools, hospitals, vocational training, welfare programs for the poor. Of course, the left, the socialist left, would have to organize civil society associations, right? Like, would have to organize people. It would have to show, right? The point of civil society associations for socialists was that the people can coordinate their activity, that it's possible for people to cooperate and to thus take back their power, and that possibility in practice is felt when you organize civil society associations. That's what that's about. I think here, again, like Ali is saying, well, because they do those things, right? Because Hamas, not because of what they want, but because they do those things. It doesn't matter the political leadership that's doing it, because they do it. And because they do it in these neighborhoods, in these dispossessed, in these slums, then it can be the conditions for some kind of left, right? Which Postone's argument against it is to say, there's nothing about the resistance that tells us about the political content of that resistance, right? So he would raise the question to Ali, right? If they were on a panel together, it would be like, so how does organizing against trade union leaders, miseducating people in the basic rights of women, killing gay people, shooting communists, how does that help create the necessary conditions in civil society association for a left? Like how does that do that? And I think here, Ali is just, he's reaching in there. He's reaching to this radical wind that's blowing from the alleys and the shacks. That's so long, right? So long as the people resist. Like, it really is that. Like, so long as the people resist, that there is hope. But perhaps, like, the resistance here is not really about freedom so much as survival, right? And that's capitalism is about survival. So the left would have to be about freedom, not survival, not just like the bare necessities of life, but it would need to be utopian in its outlook. And yeah. Thank you very much for sticking around.